Okay, hello everyone. I'm Oliver Reichardt. I'm Director of Fellowship here at the RSA, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's Thursday talk. Just before we begin, can I ask you to make sure your mobile phones are switched to silent, which I've just done, and that we're filming today and live streaming through the web. So welcome to all those who are tuning in online. And there's a reminder that the hashtag is RSA Change if you want to get involved in the discussion on Twitter. Now, housekeeping notices over, it's my great pleasure to introduce this afternoon's special guest speakers. In the field of persuasion and influence, Robert Cialdini is the world's most cited living social psychologist and the author of the seminal work on behavioral science, Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion. He is currently Regents Professor Emeritus of Psychology and Marketing at Arizona State University, and he consults, writes, and broadcasts across the world. Dr. Cialdini is joined today by Steve Martin, a Royal Society-nominated author in the field of influence and persuasion. Steve is the international best-selling author of Yes, 50 Secrets from the Science of Persuasion, written with Robert and Dr. Noah Goldstein. His business columns are read by over 2.5 million people every month, and his work applying the behavioral sciences to real-life challenges features globally in the media. Together, Robert and Steve have co-authored a new book, The Small Big, Small Changes That Spark Big Influence. In the book, and in their talk here today, they reveal the small changes that make the biggest impact when persuading others, and show how we can make the best use of this knowledge to create positive change across organizations, industries, and wider society. We're absolutely delighted to have you both here with us today, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Robert Cialdini and Steve Martin. All right.
Thank you, Ollie. Very pleased to be here. And of course, as Ollie suggested, we want to be talking about the insights that come from the new book that we've published together called The Small Big. Let me see if we can get a picture of it. Here's how this book took shape. All of the authors, Steve, my colleague Noah Goldstein, and myself, speak about the psychology of influence and the factors, the fundamental human tendencies that channel people toward assent when one or another of these principles of influence is present in a communication, in a situation. They inform people toward yes. So as we talk about these principles, usually from stages in front of audiences, we all notice the same thing. If we ever said to the audience, now, on the basis of some new research or on the basis of existing research, I'm going to tell you something small, something really small, that you can use to commission the power of one or another of these principles in your behalf, the room falls silent. Bodies incline toward the stage, faces lift to us, and pens poise over notepads, readied for that next thing we say. That was our cue. There was something important, something valued in our audience about small changes that they could employ to harness these big tendencies. Right? So, with that, we began to think about why that would be true. What would be so valuable about small changes of that sort? And it seemed to us that there were a few. First of all, remember, we would introduce this by saying, here's what the extant research says is a small change you can. So these are scientifically grounded shifts. They're things that we can be confident, relatively confident. These are reliable procedural shifts we can make that will produce these big changes. Right? Secondly, they don't require very much in terms of effort or resources in order to launch. This is of great value. It's a return on investment model that we've suddenly brought to bear here. Typically, when we think of return on investment, we think about it in financial terms. What's a small financial investment, economic contribution we can make that will produce some outsized outcome, right? Some outsized return. This is something that may be even more important in our hyper-busy, information-dense lives. Small changes that require very little time or effort on our part that launch big changes in the likelihood that people will find our persuasive messages appealing and attractive. Secondly, there's an advantage. So, because there are few costs associated with it, these changes are they are very attractive to those who would initiate programs that included those changes. They don't require a lot of budget in order to do so. Here's a secondary reason. Because they're so small, those people entrusted with implementing the changes are not daunted by them. They can undertake them and they welcome small changes where they may be quite resistant to large scale changes that require that they have to shift the way that they operate. So it has those advantages. So we reckoned this may be why people were inclining toward us when we mentioned this possibility. Now, let's ask a question. By what mechanism could we expect that a small change would produce a big outcome? How could that work? Here's what we've decided. It's that small change doesn't have the power, it launches the power, it triggers the power of something that's already stored inside us, in the way that we could flip a switch in the basement of a football stadium and a bank of lights around the stadium would go on, not because the flick of the switch was forceful in any way. It's because it commissioned, it launched, it triggered the power of force that was already installed in the system. Well, those big principles of influence that we were talking about are those installed factors. What this book is about is the smallest changes that will launch, that will commission those energies in our behalf. So, with that, let me turn things over to my co-author, Steve Martin, who's going to tell us give us some examples, both of large, existing, powerful tendencies inside people and triggers of the small, big variety that we have documented in our book.
One of the things that seems to be a source of constant fascination is this idea that whilst there may be tens of thousands of different individual influence and persuasion strategies, we can largely categorize the most successful of these strategies into one of just three core motivations, core desires inherent in each and every one of us. The first is this desire, this motivation to make efficient decisions in the most rewarding way possible. The second is this idea that we want to make decisions and behave in ways that affiliate us with others and gain their approval. And third, we want to make decisions and behave in ways that position us in the best possible light. I'd like to talk a little bit about each of these motivations in turn, provide an example of a small shift that subsequently does make a big decision. Let's talk about this first, our motivation to make decisions in an as efficient and rewarding way as possible, and talk about a challenge that we all face, I'm sure, in our everyday lives, and this is this idea to set a goal and then importantly persist and remain committed to that goal over time, whether it's making a commitment to increase our performance in our business next quarter, whether it's a goal to save a little bit of extra money towards next year's holiday, or perhaps a goal to lose a little bit of weight so we feel a little bit more healthy. One of the things that we know about goals that are motivating is that they really should have two things inherent in them. The first is that they should be sufficiently realistic to ensure that we reach that goal. That's the effective part of this core motivation. But there's another element that's going to be important insofar as we want to set ourselves goals that are sufficiently challenging, that we gain that sense of accomplishment when we do achieve them. That's the rewarding piece. And the received wisdom to date has been that when we set a goal, we think about a single specific goal and aim for that. Let's say we want to lose 3 pounds of weight per week over a period of time. And it strikes me that that single specific goal doesn't perhaps optimally speak to these two core elements. A single specific goal is typically either realistic or challenging, or oftentimes a compromise between the two, but rarely can a single number goal achieve both these aspects. But what goal can is what we describe as a high-low goal. So, for example, would it be more effective if instead of saying, let's lose 3 pounds of weight a week, we instead said, well, let's lose between 2 and 4 pounds a week and bracket that goal with a high-low number that averages the same as the single goal. And it turns out there's research that shows that this is a pretty effective change, a very small change that leads to a big difference. In these studies here, people in weight loss programs were assigned to either lose 3 pounds of weight per week or 2 to 4 pounds of weight per week. Now, the first thing that is important to recognize here is that when it comes to the specific weight loss each week, it wasn't that much of a difference. Although those that were given the high-low goal typically lost about 0.5 pound more per week, so over a 10-week period, that's 5 pounds, that's worth having. But what's especially interesting about this small change and why it talks to this motivation is the persistence of that goal over time. Only about a half of people enrolled on the program, given that single goal, then subsequently enrolled on future programs and weight loss programs. But look at the difference when they are given this high-low goal, this same goal, but with a high and low characteristic. Some 60% increase in persistence of that goal over time. So kind of raises the interesting proposition and possibility here that, a common everyday message that we receive is the importance of us eating 5 portions of fruit and vegetable each and every day. Perhaps one way we might be able to re-engage people in that strategy is to make a small shift and perhaps advocate that we want people to eat 4 to 6 portions of fruit and vegetable each and every day. A small change that could make a big difference. Let's talk about the second of these motivations. The idea that we want to make decisions in a way that affiliate us with others and gain the approval of others. One of the things that we actually know is that we as humans are motivated to create social bonds, to connect with others. And one way that we actually do that is to exchange with others, consider norms of reciprocity, that the idea that people are more likely to engage with and gain the approval of others to the extent to which there's mutual exchange. Let me give you an example from a series of studies that our co-author, Noah Goldstein, led. How many of you typically travel a lot and will stay in hotels? A fair number of you. You've probably noticed on your travels those little cards that are positioned in hotel bathrooms that encourage you to reuse your towels and linens. Interestingly, no hotel chain in the world says, please reuse your towels and linens while you stay in our hotel because it saves us cash. So you can imagine that's probably a strategy that would invite you to use many, many more towels. Instead, what hotels typically do is they appeal to your desire to be a pro-environmental citizen. Please reuse your towels and linens for the sake of the environment. Consider, though, whether or not a small change that links to this idea of exchange, reciprocity, could be employed to increase towel reuse in hotels. And in this instance, a set of cards was positioned in certain hotel rooms that pointed out the following fact to guests. Dear guests, if you do reuse your towels and linens while you stay in our hotel, this hotel chain will make a contribution as a result of the savings we make towards an environmental concern. A lot of companies do this these days, social cause marketing, these kind of things. As I suggested, the environmental appeal is a pretty effective one. About a third of people will reuse their towels and linens when asked to do so for the sake of the environment. We add this appeal: if you will do this, then we will donate a certain percentage of the savings. And what we find is that towel reuse promptly goes down, and significantly down as well. Suddenly people are having a towel party in their rooms. Why is this the case? That doesn't seem to make sense. Well, remember, it's this fundamental desire to affiliate and gain the approval of others through mutual exchange. And one of the things we know about this idea of mutual exchange is that it's typically activated by the person that goes first. There's no obligation for you to help any business that doesn't do something for you first. But there's every sense of obligation in this norm of reciprocity to help others that have done something for you first. And so in that regard, a third set of cards were positioned in hotel rooms where the hotel pointed out to guests, this is what we've already done for the environment. This is the contribution we've made. Please do your bit and help recover our expenses, in this instance by reusing your towels, and in this instance we get this very impressive increase. So the small thing here that will often lead to a big change is this idea of thinking about how we can further the advances of others, give something first. That affiliates us to others. That increases the likelihood that we will gain their approval, and it increases our influence, especially if what we give first is something that's done in an unexpected or surprising way. Final motivation, this idea that we want to be seen in the best possible light, and will behave in ways that allow us to do so. There's 120-odd people in the room. If we were to ask for a show of hands, I'm pretty sure that a significant majority of you would consider yourselves to be above-average drivers. That's an example. Similarly, the way that you describe your sports team's performance after they've won an especially big match. Didn't we play brilliantly at the weekend? Which would be entirely different had they lost that weekend, when you'd be more likely to say, weren't they rubbish? There's two good examples of everyday ways in which we act in order to increase the likelihood that we'll be seen in a positive light. Let's talk about how we might take this insight, this core, deep-seated motivation, and in this instance, make a small change that creates a huge difference to a big challenge that we face, specifically here, actually, in the United Kingdom. Our National Health Service has a problem that it's blighted by, and this is the idea of people who will make appointments at their GP surgeries, at their hospital outpatients appointments, and then for whatever reason fail to show up. The current estimates we have of the cost of this problem are somewhere in the region of about £800 million. And these are just sunk costs. The costs are likely to be even greater. For example, some people might fail to turn up to a hospital appointment and then show up somewhere else in the system with perhaps a progression of that condition, which costs even more money to deal with. But just in terms of the simple sunk costs, the lost resources, some £800 million from the many millions of missed appointments. What one small change could we make to the way that an appointment is made that could have an impact, could have a big impact? Well, in these series of studies conducted here in the UK in GP surgeries and outpatient hospital appointments, we made one small change that required a little bit more active participation in the appointment-making process. We all know what happens typically when we phone up our GP surgery and make an appointment. Assuming that we are staying online long enough to get through to someone, then we're given the next available appointment, and then the phone is promptly put down so that that busy receptionist can get to the next call that's waiting in line. The small change we made was to simply ask receptionists, after they had given the time and day of the appointment to that individual patient, to pause and ask them to verbally repeat it back. Your appointment, Mr. Smith, is next Tuesday at 2:30. Wait for one moment. The patient would repeat that back. Notice that the only investment there is perhaps an extra 1.5 seconds in time, no costs involved whatsoever. And in that instance, we actually measure a modest but still significant reduction in subsequent no-shows. That's a 3.5% reduction. 3.5% doesn't sound an awful lot, but if you consider that a 3.5% reduction of an £800 million problem is many millions of pounds, there I think is a good demonstration of a small thing that made a particularly big difference. We didn't stop there, though, with these studies. We also went one stage further and tested another strategy aligned to this idea of wanting to be seen in the best possible light. How many of you, just by way of a show of hands, when you've been at an optician's or a dentist's or a doctor's, have been given one of those little appointment cards as a reminder? Many of you in the room. Who writes the details on those cards? Yeah, the receptionist, the physician, the nurse, whoever it may be. Turns out that's the wrong person. In these studies, when we simply asked the healthcare professional, the nurse, the receptionist concerned, to hand the blank card with the pen to the individual patient so that they could write down their own appointment details. That's a commitment now that requires them to live up to in order to be seen in the best possible light. It's also a commitment that was costless for us to activate and led to a pretty impressive 18% reduction in no-shows. Now we're not talking about tens of millions of pounds, we're talking about potentially over £100 million worth of savings by simply making this small change that in this instance makes a huge difference. And each of those three aligned to those core motivations. The motivation to make decisions as efficiently and as rewarding a way as possible. The motivation to behave in ways that affiliate and gain the approval of others, and latterly, this motivation to behave in ways that position us in the best and most positive light to others. So, I think a concluding remark, perhaps?
Well, I think there's an important aspect to all of this that's worth noting, and that is, if you notice the changes that triggered these big effects, in some cases that save considerable budgets, they did not emerge as best practices within any of the industries in which we saw them working. Hotel chains didn't come up with this. Right? The National Health Service didn't come up with these ideas. It required a partnership with behavioral scientists. That's the partnership that I think is so valuable going forward for us. It was a conceptualization and a test of these ideas that required an understanding of human psychology and behavioral science. It's that the book is designed to highlight. It's that Steve and I are committed to furthering as we go forward, and that I think offers real, a genuinely exciting frontier for solving some of these abiding problems within our society in ways that are costless, are scientifically grounded, and entirely ethical at the same time. So with that, I think we should turn things over to Oliver and any questions and answers you might want to raise.
Thanks very much for that fascinating talk, and it's completely compelling, I think, the arguments and the scientific rigor with which they've been investigated and proved. I suppose while I was hearing you talk, but also when I read the book, some of you mentioned the experiments are very new, but some have been around a while, and I just wondered why they weren't more widely taken up and known. I mean, some of the ones you talk about within retail, for example, where there's a huge pressure on profits, you would think people would jump at this chance. The NHS, another good example, as you mentioned, which is desperate to find money at the moment. So I wondered why these things just weren't taken up.
You know, I have an inclination to offer an answer that has to do with something associated with the lack of understanding of how science works and what constitutes good evidence. I've been dissuaded recently away from that initial response. I think it has to do with the fact that inside these organizations, there is no such thing as a chief persuasion officer. There is no chief persuasion officer. Someone who could offer counsel based on how to best structure our communications, our messaging, our systems, so that they would be attractive for people to follow. And there is no such individual. There's a chief operating, there are financial people, there are people on all sides, but there's no one who is dedicated and has an office and a role designed to provide that kind of counsel.
Just to add a couple of things. It seems that, in other disciplines such as economics, law, engineering, that requires us to kind of formally educate ourselves to those principles, to those insights. But it seems that when we talk about behavior, when we talk about psychology, social psychology here in particular, it's almost as if we believe that we're all experts already because we are human. No one needs to tell me how and why I'm going to be influenced and persuaded. I already know by virtue of the fact that I've lived my life. And so therefore I think that also adds to this underutilization of these insights and these effects.
Yeah, we all claim we're experts and all get duped by people who understand these things, I think. Yeah. And the other thing I was wondering is, it's very interesting when the fact that it comes back to sort of three underlying factors. That was quite interesting. And the fact that one of them was to gain approval of others. And it just made me wonder whether there were any cultural biases to this, or whether there are cultural differences, because I know that some cultures have more of a social outlook as opposed to individualistic. But also, I think on all three of them there might be differences. So I just wondered if there was any cultural difference.
Quite an insightful observation, because indeed there is good research that in those cultures that have more of a collectivistic, communal orientation, as opposed to Western Europe, UK, US, and so on, which is more individualistic, these pressures to be approved by one's network are quite a bit stronger than here. So you will always find that effect. And one kind of example is, for me, the Tupperware home party, in which we are invited by a friend, a neighbor, a relative, to come to the party and buy containers that go when you press on them. That's about all they do. They are about 3 times more successful in Asia than they are anywhere else, because of the strength of the connection, the bond, the social bond. The relationship is so much more powerful and important in those communal countries. Right? So one piece of evidence that you're exactly right, that there is cultural, there's cultural variation here. Not that the need to be approved is not a culture-wide influence, but the weights, the priorities associated with these various tendencies will shift from culture to culture.
I think another additional point that's so obvious it's often missed is that none of these changes actually require a change in what's being offered. So the Tupperware doesn't change. The proposition that you make to a colleague in a different regional office doesn't change. What you change is the environment or the context in which that request or proposal or proposition is actually made. So what I think is especially insightful about talking and presenting persuasion in this way to these core motivations is it doesn't require you to change what you actually propose or offer, but just to consider first a small change to the environmental context so that that proposition that you make is elevated in terms of its potential success. That's a really interesting, I think, and often missed point. We think, how do I make my offer better? How do I incentivize more? How do I provide more information? We're not saying you need to do these things.
No, interesting. And last question before I open up to the audience, but I thought, given it's Scottish referendum day, I have a question on that, because there is the persuasion, but then there's the art of non-persuasion or fairness, and I just want to talk about the independence question, because I know there was a lot of discussion around that. Should Scotland be an independent country? And I just wondered if you had any views about whether you thought they had got the non-persuasion right there, or whether there was a bias.
You're asking about the item on the ballot, the question, should Scotland be an independent nation?
You could open it up wider, but I thought that would be a good place to start.
No, it is, and in fact, there's good research that they've loaded the dice with that question. First Minister Salmon has loaded the dice. There's a long history of research showing that a question that simply asks in the affirmative, should we do this thing, right, causes people to agree, right, to a greater extent, knew this research, and said yes. If for the other half of the oppose such a law,
in a hotel this weekend and it says investor, can you still do that type of thing, or those opportunities?
Rather than place
taxes, in order for us to use that lever, it has to be something that we are informing people about, rather than trying to use to deceive them or pressure them into compliance. Otherwise, long-term disaster.
But just to follow up on that, because I suppose the point is, I wouldn't know whether people do pay their tax on time, and I would never know, presumably now or in 10 years. So I would just read that and I would be taken in by it, regardless of its truth. And I just wondered whether the broader point, the ways you've put down about influencing people, isn't it like another tool, like a computer or a saw? Or it could be used for good, or it could be used for bad. It's just simply there to be used. However, and if there was going to be, Hitler's the extreme example, but if there are people who are thinking they could use it in nefarious ways, then they could.
And there are people who do, and Hitler's a good example. He the sense of unity that he was trying to raise to the surface, the sense of a conception of us against them. Right? Us is a positive thing, right? But when it is against the they, then it can be very destructive. So these things, I would say, they're tool-like. You might even say they're dynamite. You've got a stick of dynamite. You can use it to blow up a bridge. You can use it to build a bridge. And what we're going to suggest is that the proper strategy is the latter. So all of our books and all of our writings, we emphasize the ethics of this and the wisdom, the long-term wisdom of only using these in ethically acceptable ways.
We've only got a few minutes left, but if anyone has very quick questions, just quick fire. Yes, over down here.
Thank you. Jeremy Kaplan, Fellow of the Royal Society and marketing person. Is there any insight as to the impact of finance and financial transaction on the way people respond, as opposed to something that's more about personal benefit? The basis is simply, if you're a guest in a hotel, you're still paying, and therefore this perceived, I'm going to get served and I'm going to get my value for money, may be higher than simply something that's personal, like turn up for your appointment and you'll be healthier. Is there any insight that you can share on that?
Okay, and anyone from over here? Yes, if we go right down the side.
Thanks. Andy Martin, I'm also a fellow. I'm curious as to what you think the corollary of media literacy is here. So if you think about the power of advertising, people get increasingly savvy about being advertised to. What is the equivalent of the savvy individual saying, "Oh, you're giving me the towel card now, right? Thanks very much." And what's the impact on that over time?
Great. So just a minute response each. That would be
Well,
great.
let me take
Yeah.
this first one here then. So I'm not going to say that people don't respond to incentives. Of course they do. Oftentimes they'll respond to incentives in ways that are shaped by psychological mechanisms, and some of these psychological mechanisms we've talked about today. I think if we see these sets of tools as distinct, we only use one or we only use another, that potentially isn't the optimal way to use these. We can enhance incentives by appealing to these motivations. In some instances, an incentive alone will, sway, nudge, or shape a behavior. I think it's the smart way to think about it is I've got a palette of tools here. I can inform, I can incentivize, I can influence people into change. One of the analogies I know Bob uses quite often is this idea of the two-legged stool. If you've got just information or you've only got incentives, and those are the only two legs of your strategy, that's a pretty wobbly situation to be in. What these motivations, these influence motivations do, I think, is provide that third leg, a stability there. So I don't see them as distinct. I often see them as augmenting each other.
Maybe you want to take the savvy consumer.
Yes, and this, I think, your point is excellent because it emphasizes the need for the ethics of this. If we have a history of using strategies that inform people into assent, I don't think there's an objection to being educated. If we've used any of these strategies to deceive or coerce, then I can see exposure to them producing resistance and resentment in any future attempt from the same source. So your point, I think, highlights the differentiation, the long-term consequences of using these principles only in ethically acceptable ways. And for me, that means pointing to something that is there inherent in the situation, as opposed to manufacturing, fabricating, and certainly counterfeiting it. Let me just give you a very quick answer to this. There's a study done in Beijing, China. How can restaurant owners significantly increase the likelihood that people will select particular items on their menu? It's a small big. They put an asterisk next to that menu item that says, this is one of our most popular dishes. And each one immediately becomes 13 to 20% more popular in a way that is entirely ethical, it's truthful, entirely costless, very effective, and almost never employed. That's why we need behavioral science. Because we can point to something that you can do and test it and produce these effects, right, in a costless way that leads to everyone's benefit, because people are steered to indeed the most popular and probably the best options on the menu.
Great. Well, I'm afraid we've run out of questions, but they were a great set of questions. There is the book, The Big Small, which I've already marked certain pages on, I have to say, but they're available outside. I'm sure you'll stick around to sign copies if you'd like. But thank you for that excellent talk, and if you could join me once again in thanking Robert Cialdini and Steve Martin.